Radar spotted the incoming wave. Then the sky filled with smoke and fire. Lieutenant Commander Blackjack Morrison gripped the stick of his F-6F-3 Hellcat as the massive formation of Japanese aircraft materialized through the morning haze. From the flight deck of USS Lexington, he had launched into what intelligence promised would be the largest carrier battle since Midway. Now, climbing through 8,000 feet, with his wingman, Lieutenant Tommy Kowalski, tied on his starboard wing, Morrison watched the enemy formation spread across the horizon like a dark thundercloud. Kowalski's voice crackled through the radio. "How many of them are there?" Morrison keyed his mic. "Doesn't matter, Tommy. We've got orders to stop them before they reach the task force." He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp engine surge with power. The Hellcat had been built for moments like this, fast, heavily armed, and tough enough to absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero. The date was June 19, 1944, and Task Force 58 was spread across the Philippine Sea in the largest carrier formation ever assembled by the United States Navy. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers stretched across miles of blue Pacific water. Admiral Raymond Spruance had positioned his fleet to intercept the Japanese mobile fleet as it attempted to destroy the American invasion of Saipan. What neither side fully realized was that this day would mark the end of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. Morrison's radio crackled with reports from other flights. The Japanese had launched everything they had, over 430 aircraft from 9 carriers, including their newest and most experienced pilots. But the Americans had been waiting. Fighter direction officers aboard the carriers had been tracking the incoming raids for over an hour, vectoring defensive fighters into perfect intercept positions. "Bandits at 2 o'clock high," Morrison called out, spotting a formation of Nakajima B-6 NGIL torpedo bombers escorted by Mitsubishi E-6M0 fighters. "Let's take the fighters first." He rolled his Hellcat into a diving turn, Kowalski following close behind. The morning sun glinted off the rising meatball insignias as the two formations closed at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour. The first Zero pilot never saw Morrison coming. The Hellcat 6. 50 caliber machine guns erupted in a concentrated burst that tore through the lightweight fighter's wing root. The Zero tumbled out of formation, trailing fire and smoke as it fell toward the ocean below. Morrison pulled up sharply, looking for his next target as tracers began streaking past his canopy. The sky exploded into chaos as nearly 450 American fighters launched from Task Force 58's carriers met the incoming Japanese strike. Morrison had trained for this moment for 2 years, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer intensity of the aerial battle that erupted over the Philippine Sea. A Zero dove out of the sun, its 20mm cannon shells walking across Morrison's starboard wing. He hauled the Hellcat into a tight left turn, feeling the G-forces slam him into his seat. The Japanese pilot was good, probably a veteran of Pearl Harbor or the early Pacific campaigns, but his Zero was no match for the Hellcat's superior speed and firepower. Morrison reversed his turn, using the Hellcat's better roll rate to get inside the Zero's turning circle. "Blackjack, you've got 2 more coming down on you." Kowalski's warning came just as Morrison squeezed the trigger. His burst caught the Zero in the engine cowling, and the radial engine seized in a shower of oil and metal fragments. The fighter nosed over and dove toward the sea, but Morrison had no time to watch it crash. He pulled up hard, spotting the 2 Zeros that Kowalski had warned him about. The lead Zero opened fire at extreme range, its bullets falling short. Morrison smiled grimly, another sign that these weren't the elite pilots Japan had started the war with. An experienced pilot would have closed to point-blank range before opening fire. Instead, Morrison used the Zero's mistake to close the distance himself. The Hellcat's heavy armament gave him an advantage that Japanese pilots couldn't match. He could kill at ranges where their lighter guns were ineffective. His next burst sent the lead Zero spinning toward the ocean in flames. The second Japanese pilot, seeing his squadron leader shot down, broke off his attack and tried to flee. But the Hellcat was 30 miles per hour faster than the Zero in level flight, and Morrison ran him down like a greyhound chasing a rabbit. One quick burst into the Zero's cockpit, and the fighter rolled over and dove straight into the sea. "That's 3. Morrison muttered to himself, then keyed his radio. "Tommy, where are you?" "Right behind you, Skipper." "Just splashed 2 Judies myself." Kowalski's Hellcat pulled alongside Morrison's, both aircraft showing bullet holes and scorched paint from near misses. "Look at that mess down there." Morrison followed Kowalski's gaze toward the ocean. The surface was dotted with oil slicks, debris, and life rafts, the remains of dozens of Japanese aircraft that had been shot down in the first 20 minutes of combat. But the battle was far from over. Wave after wave of Japanese planes were still approaching the task force, and Morrison could see torpedo bombers and dive bombers breaking through the fighter screen. Radio chatter filled Morrison's headset as the battle reached its crescendo. American fighters were shooting down Japanese aircraft at a rate that seemed impossible, 4 and 5 to 1 in some engagements. The reasons were becoming clear as the fight progressed. Japanese pilot training had deteriorated catastrophically as their experienced instructors were killed in earlier battles, while American pilot quality had improved dramatically. Tally-ho. Large formation of Judies at 10 o'clock low. The call came from Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, leading VF-15 from USS Essex. Morrison looked down to see a formation of Yokosuka D-4Y, Judy dive bombers approaching the carriers. These were the real threat. If they got through, they could cripple the American task force. Morrison pushed his stick forward, diving toward the bombers with Kowalski on his wing. The Japanese pilots were flying in a tight V formation, their rear gunners already firing at the approaching Hellcats. Morrison ignored the tracers streaking past his canopy and concentrated on the lead bomber. At 400 yards, he opened fire. The .50 caliber bullets tore through the Judy's thin aluminum skin like paper. The bomber's starboard wing folded up, and the aircraft cartwheeled into the sea. Morrison pulled up slightly and selected his next target, but Kowalski had already claimed it with a perfect deflection shot that sent the bomber diving in flames. "Watch it, Blackjack." Kowalski's warning came just as Morrison felt his Hellcat shudder under the impact of cannon shells. A Zero had dove out of the clouds above, trying to protect the bombers. Morrison felt the controls go mushy as hydraulic fluid streamed from his port wing, but the Hellcat kept flying. He hauled back on the stick, trading airspeed for altitude as the Zero pilot tried to follow. The Japanese pilot made a fatal mistake. He tried to climb with the Hellcat instead of using his superior maneuverability in a turning fight. Morrison waited until the Zero's nose came up, then pushed over into a high side attack. His first burst missed, but the second caught the Zero's wing root. The fighter's wings separated from the fuselage in a shower of fabric and metal, and the Zero tumbled toward the ocean below. Morrison's engine was running rough now, and he could smell burning oil in the cockpit. But around him, the sky was clearing of Japanese aircraft. The few survivors were fleeing westward, leaving behind a sea littered with wreckage and bodies. In less than an hour, American fighters had shot down over 240 Japanese aircraft in what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The morning's slaughter was only the beginning. As Morrison limped his damaged Hellcat back toward the Lexington, his radio crackled with reports of another massive Japanese strike approaching from the west. Admiral Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, was committing his remaining aircraft in a desperate attempt to salvage something from the disaster. Morrison's crew chief, Petty Officer First Class Murphy, met him as he climbed out of his bullet-riddled fighter. "Holy Skipper, what did you tangle with?" "About half the Japanese Navy," Morrison replied, examining the damage to his aircraft. 23 bullet holes peppered the fuselage and wings, and hydraulic fluid dripped steadily onto the flight deck. "How long to patch her up?" Murphy ran his hands over the worst damage. "Give me 30 minutes, sir. I can stop the leaks and patch the holes, but she won't be pretty." Morrison nodded and headed for the ready room, where intelligence officers were already debriefing returning pilots. The picture they painted was almost unbelievable. American losses were minimal, while Japanese casualties were catastrophic. Experienced squadron commanders who had survived Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Guadalcanal were dead, along with hundreds of younger pilots who represented the future of Japanese naval aviation. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, the Navy's leading fighter tactician, was coordinating the defense against the second wave. "They're coming in smaller groups this time," he briefed the assembled pilots. Looks like they've learned something from this morning's massacre. But our radar coverage is complete and we'll vector you onto them before they can reach the task force. Morrison grabbed a cup of coffee and a sandwich, knowing it might be his last meal for hours. Around him, other pilots were checking their ammunition loads and discussing tactics. The mood was confident but not cocky. Everyone knew that the Japanese still had experienced pilots who could be dangerous if given the chance. "Hey, Blackjack," Kowalski dropped into the chair beside him. "Did you hear the latest count? They're saying we got over 200 of them this morning alone." Morrison shook his head in amazement. He had witnessed aerial combat throughout the Pacific War, but nothing like this morning's one-sided slaughter. The Japanese had thrown away 2 years' worth of pilot training in a single morning, and their naval aviation would never recover. The ready room's speakers crackled to life. "Pilots, man your planes. Large bogey formation approaching from bearing 270. This is not a drill." Morrison's patched-up Hellcat felt different as he climbed away from the Lexington's flight deck. The damaged hydraulics made the controls heavy, and the engine ran rough at high power settings. But the big fighter was still capable of fighting, and Morrison had no intention of sitting out the afternoon section. This time, the Japanese were more cautious. Instead of massed formations, they approached in smaller groups, trying to slip through the American fighter screen. But Task Force 58's radar coverage was too complete, and fighter direction officers vectored intercepts onto each group before they could reach the carriers. Morrison found himself leading a 4-plane division toward a group of torpedo bombers approaching from the northwest. The Japanese had learned from the morning's disaster and were flying much lower, trying to stay below radar coverage. But American radar technology had improved dramatically since 1942, and the low-flying attackers were spotted while still 50 miles from the task force. "Tally-ho. 8 Kates at 2 o'clock low," Morrison called out, spotting the Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber skimming just above the waves. These were older aircraft, but still dangerous if they could get close enough to launch their torpedoes. He pushed his stick forward, leading his division into a diving attack. The Japanese rear gunners opened fire as the Hellcats approached, but their light machine guns were no match for the Americans' heavy armament. Morrison's first burst killed the rear gunner in the lead Kate, and his second shattered the bomber's port engine. The torpedo bomber nosed into the sea in a shower of spray and debris. Behind him, the other 3 Hellcats were making similar work of the remaining bombers. The Japanese pilots tried desperately to reach torpedo launch range, but they were flying aircraft designed in the 1930s against fighters that represented the cutting edge of 1940s technology. Within 5 minutes, all 8 torpedo bombers had been shot down. "Splash 8 bandits," Morrison reported to the Task Force Combat Information Center. No survivors observed. The radio crackled with similar reports from across the Philippine Sea. American fighter pilots were finding and destroying Japanese aircraft faster than intelligence officers could count them. By late afternoon, it was becoming clear that the Japanese mobile fleet had suffered the most devastating defeat in naval aviation history. Morrison's fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank when he spotted smoke on the horizon. A Japanese strike had somehow penetrated the fighter screen and was attacking the carriers of Task Group 58.7. He pushed his throttle forward, ignoring the rough engine, and headed toward the fight. The scene that greeted Morrison as he approached Task Group 58.7 was both horrifying and magnificent. USS Bunker Hill was under attack by a handful of Japanese dive bombers that had somehow survived the gauntlet of American fighters. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky like a deadly fireworks display, and the carrier was maneuvering violently to avoid the falling bombs. Morrison counted only 4 Japanese aircraft, 3 Judy dive bombers, and a single Zero escort. These were probably the last survivors of a much larger strike, and they were pressing their attack with the desperate courage of men who knew they wouldn't be going home. The Zero pilot spotted Morrison's approaching Hellcat and turned to intercept, giving the bombers precious seconds to line up their attack runs. Morrison accepted the challenge, hauling his fighter into a head-on pass with the Japanese pilot. Both aircraft opened fire simultaneously at 500 yards range. The Zero's 20mm cannon shells walked across Morrison's engine cowling, but the Hellcat's radial engine absorbed the punishment and kept running. Morrison's 6 .50 caliber guns converged on the Zero's cockpit, and the lightweight fighter disintegrated in a ball of fire and aluminum fragments. But he was too late to save the bunker hill. One of the Judy pilots, showing the skill that marked him as one of Japan's few remaining veterans, put his 500-pound bomb squarely into the carrier's flight deck. The explosion sent aircraft and men flying like toys, and secondary fires began burning throughout the ship. Morrison dove on the remaining bombers as they pulled out of their attacks. His ammunition was running low, only about 50 rounds per gun, but he made every shot count. His first target, a Judy trying to escape at low altitude, died under a perfectly aimed burst that detonated its remaining bomb. The explosion was so violent that Morrison had to bank sharply to avoid the debris. The last Japanese pilot, perhaps realizing fatescape was impossible, turned his damaged bomber toward the nearest American destroyer. Morrison recognized the kamikaze attack developing and poured his remaining ammunition into the diving bomber. His guns fell silent just as the Judy cartwheeled into the sea, less than 100 yards from the destroyer's bow. As the sun began to set over the Philippine Sea, Morrison turned his battered Hellcat toward home. Behind him, the bunker hill was fighting fires but still afloat. Around him, the sky was empty of Japanese aircraft for the first time in 12 hours. Morrison's fuel gauge was deep in the red zone when the Lexington appeared on the horizon. His engine was running so rough that he wasn't sure it would keep running long enough to reach the deck, and his hydraulics had failed completely, making the controls almost impossible to move. The carrier's flight deck was a scene of controlled chaos as dozens of damaged aircraft returned from the day's battles. Some fighters were so shot up that their pilots barely made it aboard before their engines quit. Others had been patched up with canvas and prayer, their bullet holes covered with fabric and tape. Morrison's approach was ugly. Without hydraulics, he couldn't lower his flaps or landing gear properly. The Hellcat hit the deck hard, bounced twice, and finally caught the number 3 arresting wire. As the fighter jerked to a stop, Morrison could hear his engine give a final cough and die. Crew Chief Murphy was waiting for him as he climbed out of the cockpit. "Welcome home, Skipper. Heard you had quite a day." Morrison looked back at his fighter, counting the new bullet holes. "That makes 5 confirmed kills, Murphy. Maybe 6 if they credit me with that last kamikaze." "Yes, sir. And word is, the whole task force got over 300 of them today. Biggest turkey shoot in naval history, they're calling it." As Morrison walked across the flight deck toward the island superstructure, he passed citizens of other returning pilots. Their faces showed the exhaustion and exhilaration of men who had fought the battle of their lives and won decisively. But there was also a soberness in their expressions. They had witnessed the virtual destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. In the ready room, intelligence officers were still tallying the day's results. The numbers were staggering. Over 340 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with American losses of only 29 planes. More importantly, hundreds of irreplaceable Japanese pilots were dead, including many veterans who could never be replaced. Lieutenant Commander Thatch stood before a map of the Philippine Sea, pointing out the locations where Japanese aircraft had been shot down. "Gentlemen, you've just fought the most one-sided aerial battle in history. The Japanese mobile fleet has been effectively eliminated as a fighting force. Their pilot training program can't replace losses like this." Morrison found a quiet corner and began writing his after-action report. As he documented each engagement, each kill, he realized that he had witnessed something more than just a military victory. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had marked the end of Japanese naval aviation's ability to challenge American dominance in the Pacific. 3 days later, Morrison stood on the Lexington's flight deck as Task Force 58 steamed westward in pursuit of the retreating Japanese fleet. The sea that had been filled with the debris of aerial combat was now eerily quiet. Scattered oil slicks and floating wreckage were the only reminders of the catastrophic battle that had taken place. The Japanese mobile fleet had withdrawn toward Okinawa, but intelligence reports indicated that Admiral Ozawa had fewer than 100 operational aircraft remaining from the 430 he had launched 3 days earlier. Japanese carrier aviation, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months after Pearl Harbor, was finished as an effective fighting force. Morrison's new Hellcat, his fifth aircraft of the war, bore the markings of his confirmed victories. 12 small Japanese flags painted below the cockpit, 5 of them added after the turkey shoot. But he took no pleasure in the kills themselves. Each flag represented a Japanese pilot who would never go home to his family, never see his children grow up. "Skipper, you got a minute?" Kowalski approached, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing a thoughtful expression that Morrison had rarely seen on his usually cheerful wingman. "Sure, Tommy. What's on your mind?" Kowalski leaned against the carrier's island superstructure and stared out at the empty sea. "I was talking to some of the intelligentskies, and they're saying this battle basically ended the war for Japanese naval aviation. No more carrier battles, no more experienced pilots to train new ones." Morrison nodded slowly. "That's probably right. We didn't just win a battle 3 days ago, we eliminated their ability to fight future battles. Makes you think about what we're doing out here," Kowalski continued. "I mean, I know we're fighting to end the war and save American lives. But when you shoot down 300 planes in one day, when you kill that many pilots..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Morrison understood what his wingman was struggling with. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had been a military necessity. The Japanese fleet had to be stopped before it could interfere with the invasion of Saipan. But the sheer scale of the destruction was sobering, even for veterans who had been fighting for 2 years. "The Japanese started this war, Tommy," Morrison said finally. "They attacked Pearl Harbor. They conquered half the Pacific. They treated prisoners and civilians with unbelievable brutality. We didn't choose this fight, but we're sure going to finish it." As if to his point, a radio message crackled across the task force frequency. American ground forces on Saipan had broken through the Japanese defensive lines and were advancing toward the island's capital. The invasion that Task Force 58 had been protecting was succeeding, bringing the war one step closer to Japan itself. A week after the turkey shoot, Morrison found himself in Pearl Harbor, attending a debriefing session with Admiral Nimitz' staff. The statistics they presented were even more devastating than the initial reports. 346 Japanese aircraft destroyed, over 450 pilots killed or missing, and 3 Japanese carriers so badly damaged they would never again operate aircraft. American losses were almost insignificant by comparison: 29 aircraft lost, with 27 pilots rescued. The kill ratio was over 12 to 1, a level of air superiority that no military force in history had ever achieved against a competent enemy. The implications are clear. Admiral Forrest Sherman told the assembled pilots and staff officers, "Japanese naval aviation is finished. They simply cannot replace the pilots they lost, and their training program has collapsed under the pressure of war. From now on, the Pacific Fleet will face only land-based aircraft and the remnants of their Army Air Force." Morrison listened to the briefing with mixed emotions. As a professional naval officer, he understood that the turkey shoot had shortened the war and saved countless American lives. The Japanese mobile fleet would never again threaten American operations in the Pacific, and future invasions could proceed without fear of carrier-based air attacks. But as a pilot who had participated in the slaughter, he also understood the human cost. Over 400 young Japanese men had died in a single day, most of them barely out of their teens. Their training had been inadequate, their equipment obsolete, and their tactics suicidal. They had been sent to die by commanders who knew the mission was hopeless. After the briefing, Morrison walked out onto the dock where Lexington was moored for repairs and resupply. The carrier's flight deck was crowded with new aircraft: F-6F to 5 Hellcats with improved engines and armament, SB-2C Helderver dive bombers, and TBF Avenger torpedo planes. The U.S. Navy's air arm was stronger than ever, while their Japanese counterparts were virtually eliminated. Lieutenant Commander McCampbell joined him at the railing, both men staring out at Pearl Harbor's calm waters. McCampbell had shot down 7 Japanese aircraft during the turkey shoot, bringing his total to 19 confirmed kills. "You know what the really tragic thing is?" McCampbell said quietly. "Some of those Japanese pilots we shot down were probably better men than we are. They were just fighting for the wrong cause with the wrong equipment and the wrong training." Morrison nodded. "War doesn't care about individual merit, Dave. It just cares about which side can build more planes, train more pilots, and put more ordnance on target. We won because America's industrial capacity is 10 times greater than Japan's, not because we're better people. 6 months later, Morrison found himself flying his final combat mission of the war. The Japanese Empire was collapsing, their cities burning under B-29 raids, their merchant fleet sunk, their armies stranded on bypass islands throughout the Pacific. The carriers that had launched the Turkey Shoot were now supporting the invasion of Okinawa, the last stepping stone before Japan itself. But there were no more great carrier battles. The Japanese had fewer than 50 operational carrier aircraft remaining in their entire navy, and most of their experienced pilots were dead. The war had become a grinding campaign of attrition, with American forces methodically destroying what remained of Japanese military power. Morrison's logbook showed 127 combat missions, 16 confirmed aerial victories, and dozens of ground attack sorties against Japanese positions. He had flown from 6 different carriers, lost 4 aircraft to enemy action, and been decorated with the Navy Cross, Silver Star, and Distinguished Flying Cross. By any measure, he had done his duty. As he flew his final patrol over the waters where the Turkey Shoot had taken place, Morrison reflected on what that one-sided battle had meant for the course of the war. In a single day, American naval aviation had achieved complete air superiority over the Pacific. The Japanese would never again be able to challenge major American operations, and the path to victory was clear. But the cost had been enormous on both sides. Over 400 Japanese pilots had died in the Turkey Shoot, and thousands more would die in the kamikaze attacks that became their final desperate strategy. American casualties were lighter, but still significant. 29 pilots lost during the battle itself, and hundreds more in the grinding campaigns that followed. The war ended 3 months later with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by Japan's surrender. Morrison was aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay when General MacArthur accepted the Japanese capitulation, officially ending the Pacific War. As he watched the Japanese delegation sign the surrender documents, Morrison thought about the young pilots he had shot down over the Philippine Sea. They had died fighting for a cause they believed in, just as he had been prepared to die for his. The difference was that American industrial might, technological superiority, and pilot training had made their sacrifice meaningless. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had been the beginning of the end for Imperial Japan. In destroying over 300 aircraft and 400 pilots in a single day, American carrier aviation had eliminated the last serious threat to Allied naval operations in the Pacific. The war would continue for another 14 months, but its outcome had been decided in the skies over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. Morrison folded his flight log and tucked it into his jacket pocket. The war was over, and it was time to go home. Behind him, the carriers that had fought at the Turkey Shoot were already heading back to American ports, their mission accomplished. The age of the aircraft carrier had reached its zenith in the Philippine Sea, and the lesson was clear. In modern warfare, control of the air meant control of the sea, and control of the sea meant victory. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had proven that lesson beyond any doubt, written in the contrails and wreckage scattered across 100 miles of Pacific Ocean. It was a lesson that would shape naval warfare for generations to come, purchased with the lives of over 400 young men who had climbed into their aircraft one final time and flown into history.